This is a video about your Paper 2 draft, which is due the Tuesday that you guys come back from this weekend. I want to make sure that you know what some of my expectations are, and I wanted to just give you some advice on how to complete this assignment. I kind of like this cartoon at the beginning. You know, we all used to hate writing assignments, but hopefully after a little while and after maybe some advice from your professor, you can start to enjoy them. So here are some of the goals of your draft. I would like for this to be a 2 to 3 page draft and your works cited page, which means that you should make an attempt at a works cited page and your in-text citations. Try to have your full 2 to 3 pages. The more that you write in this draft, the more feedback you can get from your partners in your workshop, and the more feedback you can get from me, your professor. Now, the next thing that you should also have is a very solid thesis. We worked on your thesis a bit on Tuesday, but I would like to really make sure that we've got a good thesis for you. And I'm going to show you how to break this down in just a moment. You should also have some body paragraphs that are comparing and contrasting your two characters. Those body paragraphs should include evidence from the text, and then you should really make an effort to tie in those pieces of evidence back into your thesis. Finally, you should have a conclusion, and then you should also have some in-text citations. And I'm going to show you how to do all of this, give you some tips and advice on how to approach this for your paper. So let's break it down. Your intro. Your intro should include multiple things. The first thing you should do is acclimate your reader to the stories that you are comparing and contrasting. Introduce your characters to us. Let us know a little bit about the stories, but also think of some sort of an attention grabber that could be the first line of your paper. You don't want the first line of your paper to be somebody else's words, like a quote. Try to think about the bigger picture or the bigger message that you're trying to convey with this story. Is there some sort of an argument that you want your readers to walk away with? Bring that to their attention first. Get their attention. Hit them with some details, and then go into your thesis. So you should have an attention grabber, and then 1 to 2 sentences of summary of the stories. No more than that. You're going to get the chance to bring in more details of your story as you go, but this paper should not be summary heavy. The other thing that you want to do is identify the big connection between your characters, or the thread that connects your characters. This thread is the thing that your characters have in common. But your goal in this paper is not to talk about what your characters actually have in common, but in that commonality, in that moment that they look or sound or appear like each other, how are they different? And this brings us to your thesis. Your thesis is kind of the overarching argument for your paper. So below I have a sample thesis for you. My sample thesis is the princes in both Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella try to track down their princess. But ultimately, Cinderella's prince is more passive than Sleeping Beauty's. Now I'm going to go on then in the paper to talk about how they both track down their princess, right? The princess, the tracking down of the princess, but ultimately what I am going to focus on is this fact that the prince is more passive in Cinderella than in Sleeping Beauty. So because that prince is more passive, I need to come up with examples in my paper of how that prince is passive in the tracking down of Cinderella, and how the prince from Sleeping Beauty is more active in his pursuit of his princess. So this is a sample thesis that you could include in your paper. Something that is connecting them. The connection is the tracking down of the princess, but then also how are they different? And that's the big goal of the paper, is how are they different in that similarity? So now we move on to the body paragraphs. And in the body paragraphs, you should include 2 to 4 examples of how these characters share that common thread and how they might be different in that thread. So the first thing you want to do is in each paragraph, introduce the main point. What is the main point of the paper? So some of the examples that I could give of Cinderella's prince being more passive is that he is not the person who goes in pursuit of Cinderella when Cinderella leaves the ball. He sends guards after her. I could give another example that at the end, and this could be a separate paragraph, when they go and search for the maiden who fits the golden slipper or the glass slipper, whichever story version you know, the prince doesn't actually go with the slipper. He doesn't go and try this shoe onto everybody's foot. He sends the footman to do the dirty work. The prince is a more passive and inactive bystander to the events that's going on in the story. Now, on the contrary, I would like to show how Sleeping Beauty's prince is more active. So I may give the example or the main point that Sleeping Beauty's prince first hears about the princess and goes on pursuit himself to go find her. He then has to battle his way through a thicket of thorns. Then he has to fight a dragon. And finally, once he gets to the top of the tower to get a hold of Sleeping Beauty, he's actually the one who has to kiss her awake. He doesn't send anybody else to do this. He's a much more active prince. So even though in my thesis I'm talking about how the princes share the common ground of having to pursue their princesses, you can obviously see that Sleeping Beauty's prince is much more active than Cinderella's prince. So the first thing you want to do is introduce those main points. Then, in that paragraph that introduces the main point, you want to give an example from the text. This is where you could bring in your quotes or a little bit of summary of what happens. And make sure that if you bring in a quote, that you introduce your quote. That you say, according to so-and-so, here is my quote. Or we see an example of this in this quote. And I'm going to give you some examples of how to introduce quotes in a handout on Blackboard. You also want to make sure if this next part is a little confusing. You want to make sure that what you are quoting is word for word. That actually should say word for word, not word for work. You want to make sure that you are quoting things word for word. Do not change the wording of a quote. Do not change the wording of a quote. Make sure that you have it exactly the way that it is. And when you get the chance, try to paraphrase. Use part of a quote. Or, just quote a couple of words rather than the entire sentence. Oftentimes, this will help you incorporate your quotes better into your words. Therefore, they're supporting your argument rather than taking the spotlight. And then once you have introduced the main point, given an example from the text, you then want to connect that example back to your main point. This next part, this last bullet point, should take 2 to 3 sentences. Talk about how that example makes the character similar or different. Talk about how it makes the character maybe problematic. But either way, you have to relate it back to the thesis so that your overall argument is nice and clear. Another thing you need to consider in your body paragraphs of your paper is the balance of analysis and summary. I saw in a lot of essays, in a lot of Paper 1 essays, that you were summarizing what the poem was about, but not really analyzing how your examples were working within the poem. And this is something that I would like to really try to focus on in Paper 2. I want you to try to analyze, not over-summarize. So before you can see on the left an example of analysis, and then on the right an example of summary. So let's take a look and see how these might sound a little different and what's going on in the analysis that isn't happening in the summary. The summary reads, "The prince hires a footman to try the shoe on every maiden in the land. Once the footman visits Cinderella's house, he tries the shoe on her stepsisters. Once they break the shoe, Cinderella provides the other glass slipper. This makes the prince a passive participant in the trying on of the shoe." And now for the analysis. One instance in which Cinderella's prince is passive is in the act of finding his princess, is the fact that he sends a servant with the shoe to find her. Since he doesn't go on his own to complete the task, he becomes a bystander in the process. The footman is more active in the pursuit of Cinderella than the prince, taking away from the romantic idea of the prince actually doing the dirty work. Can you see how the analysis is more of a commentary of why this is problematic, rather than the summary, which is just stating what happened in the story? I want your writing to sound more like the one on the left. I want you to insert your opinion in third person. This is all written in third person, without bringing in too much summary from the story. In here, you still get that the footman is the one who pursues Cinderella rather than the prince, but you're not telling it to me in a play-by-play format. I just want you to kind of focus on trying to analyze versus summarizing. The next thing you should focus on is your conclusion. Once you've written your intro, your 2 to 4 body paragraphs, then your conclusion really should wrap up your paper. Now, your conclusion should not be a lot of summary, maybe one sentence max. You should bring in your thesis statement again, totally reworded, not the same word-for-word thesis from the intro. And then you should also allude to something that the reader might learn or the big picture. Why is this paper important? Why is this argument important? So here is a sample conclusion from my princess paper. The princes have the same goals in their stories, but only Sleeping Beauty's prince is active in his pursuit of her. Prince Charming failed to be active in gaining Cinderella and looks pathetic in comparison. In the end, both princes don't provide very good role models for their reader. One gives you the feeling that if you wait patiently, he will send someone to find you for him. And the other makes you think that someday the prince will fight the dragon and rescue you. Wouldn't it be nicer to hear a fairy tale with a princess who saves herself, shows who she really is to the prince, and in the end doesn't need a prince to make her happy? Now that would be a story I would read to my children. You'll notice that I give a little bit of summary. I restate the thesis here. I give a little bit of summary of how I felt about the princes, but then I go into the bigger picture. And the bigger picture for me with this paper would be, what kind of a message is this sending the reader? And who is the reader of fairy tales, but usually young, impressionable children who might think that this is a model for how life is. And I'm trying to avoid that. I really want to have my reader question why these princes might not be really good role models. So once you're done with your conclusion, the last thing to do is to really work on your in-text citations. You should remember that this is a short story, not a poem. It's just the author and the page number of the story. The citations go after anything that is paraphrased, quoted, or summarized from the text. This is anything that is not your opinion. Your works cited page should still be a work from an anthology. You should start with the author of the story and then the story title. The rest should be the same as paper 1. Also make sure that you have the correct page numbers. So where does this leave us for Tuesday? I would like for you to submit your paper draft online by class time on 10/13, that's next Tuesday, by 1 o'clock p.m. Sorry,